My first question to you is, what do we mean by the concept of ethics? Let's define that so we can build on it.
An ethic is a codified belief and action of a society to pursue good and avoid harm. There are a lot of general principles that could be listed, but in essence, the golden rule we all know: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Another rule is called the silver rule. If you've never heard of that one, it says, do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. So there's a negative aspect to this whole thing: help and harm. Jesus said the most important, in reply to a lawyer who asked him what was the most important commandment, he replied, the most important one, Israel, listen. One God, our God is the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: you will love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. So the second commandment really outlines for a Christian what an ethic would be.
Okay, so an ethic is concentrating on what we want to do one to another that we have done to ourselves, and what we would avoid doing one to another that we did not want to happen to ourselves, okay? Here's our setup. Now frame that in the definition of bioethics.
And this comes down essentially to what society attempts to do to apply these principles to the interface of science and culture, medicine particularly, but science in general. And this is where I'm talking about tonight. The first thing I would like to talk about is the Christian perspective. And Christians in general accept the Bible as truth, inherent truth. And the problem, though, that we face when we're dealing with a non-Christian society or people who don't have the strength of belief that we do is that, as one author said, the best one can expect from such people is justice, not love, because they aren't generally acting on the principle of love. The other problem that we have is autonomy, and it ends up in a very subjective ethical process. What's important to me is what is important to me. What's important to you is important to you. And the other part of this is it becomes really, people feel it's much too restrictive on their ability to do things that they would like to do, particularly in science research. We'll get into that a little bit later.
Before you go to secular, can I make a point here? This is important about autonomy. Autonomy says I'm an individual, I make up my own mind. Autonomy in God, that relationship with God, is that there's someone beyond us who's Lord of our life, and we're not totally independent of that deity. But, you know, the more you talk about autonomy, the more I realize that it's getting even more confusing because churches now are becoming autonomous.
Amen.
And churches now are deciding on their own what is truth and what isn't. The statistics you gave last week are still bothering me about how many people call themselves Christian, yet how many of them actually don't think there's an absolute truth. This is troubling, and it's a cause for pause, and it's cause for us to further clarify continually what it is we believe. So, as you might, if you're listening, you don't know this church does now and will continue to believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, the absolute truth. We are not autonomous, and they're not given the choice to add or take away, as it says at the end of the Bible, that there's a curse for those who wish to do so. But yet, for some reason, churches are doing so. So even when you talk about a Christian perspective, I think we have to clarify nowadays, right, what are we talking about here? This is getting really ridiculous. Okay, secular perspective, I'm sorry.
Sure, that's fine. I agree with what you said. In fact, medicine as a whole, by most people, from a secular point of view, is thought to be value neutral. Value neutral. That is, there's no specific value to one thing versus another that you can assign purely because it's there. That means the only value becomes what works. In other words, if a medication or a procedure works for you, then it's of value. If it didn't work, it was not of value. And of course, autonomy comes back into this process because People are looking out for what they feel is best for them, which is, of course, a good objective, but on the other hand, it can't be at the cost of common good and still be a bioethical goal. An objective outcome, therefore, becomes less likely to happen because everything becomes what I think it should be. And again, you get into problems with dealing with medicine and the medical providers when you bring into a situation what you think ought to happen, and they know that that's not the best thing for you. Then you have to work through those issues. There is no extrinsic moral code, therefore, and this results in unresolved conflicts between both providers within themselves and providers and patients. It mechanizes medicine. It makes it more of a mechanical opportunity. I think probably you've noticed that when you've gone to the hospital, to your doctors lately, maybe that you don't feel as maybe they can't pay as much attention to you. They don't have as much time to interface with you. It becomes more of a mechanized process.
Could you pause for right there and tell us what kind of shift has taken place in medicine that has gotten away from the centralized personal care of one doctor and more to a team, and why?
Well, I guess the biggest problem with medicine is we can do too much and it costs too much. Those are two problems. And as the shift goes from the individual being responsible for the payment for his care to third parties, particularly the government and insurance, they begin to call the tune as to what's going to happen in that interface. And if you throw in other entities, hospitals, clinics, everybody's trying to maximize the money that can come to them, while the patients, through the government and their providers, are trying to minimize. So there's a conflict all the time. You may go to the doctor and he's trying to see 20 patients an hour. I mean, you're used to spending a half an hour with him. He's not going to spend a half an hour with you. That's the mechanized thing I'm talking. And it results then in a contractual relationship, essentially. He agrees to see you and try and make you better, and you agree to put up with the fact that he's only going to see you for 5 minutes.
But don't you also, you're going to see a physician's assistant more, you're going to see a physical therapist more, you're going to see a nurse practitioner more, right?
Yeah, physician extenders have become very common. There's nothing wrong with well-trained physician extenders. They do good care, and if they're supervised well by the physicians that they work under, you're in good hands in general. Now, if you throw on top of this new paradigm, you throw in postmodernism, it really gets confusing. Because now we've got a chaos of moral diversity and a cacophony of competing moral choices. That is, who knows who's in charge? And so we have a circumstance where the postmodern world has kind of put the death to rationality, but at the same time, they're trying to develop a code of ethics that's rational. So the problems they bring to us is confusion and distrust, and expediency is the primary goal. Get it done.
Okay, something that we've talked about in each of our sessions that is becoming a theme here is personhood, the diminishing or the dilution of personhood in various levels of society. So let's talk about what exactly is this relationship between personhood and bioethics. And I guess the first would be in the area of abortion.
Yes, again, the key issue that we've talked about before is what is a person and how does one keep one's personhood. And abortion has become confused because it's one area that I'll be talking about in a minute. Stem cell research is another. Physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia is another. Medical tourism, probably I've never heard of that, but people go abroad to get care because they can get it cheaper. And there's a whole industry based around medical tourism. They go abroad often to get transplants that they pay for, often given from people such as prisoners or other entities that are not able to resist the donation. The other area would be lots of problems with orphaned embryos. There's over 800,000 orphaned embryos sitting in freezers right now around the country. These are embryos that have been conceived and frozen for future use, but the people that did that no longer want those embryos. And another thing that just came forward, these are just a spattering. I mean, it's myriad. I saw yesterday about sex selection for embryos, so you have the right family available. You have 3 boys and you want a girl. You fertilize a bunch of eggs and decide which one's the girl, and that's the one you implant. Now, all those embryos are still in the freezer, so that's an ethical problem. We have to remember a person is not a property thing. I mean, it doesn't belong to anybody. It's human. And it exists as the person exists as an entire person. And they exhibit behavior specific to a human all their lives, and they remain the same through their lives. We have an identity that goes through life that starts with the conception and goes on through till death. Now, to get a little bit more into abortion, to think about that a little bit more, the fetus develops, of course, over a 9-month period of time from conception on. Scientists or physicians have observed heartbeats at 18 to 21 days. Organs are formed and movement begins at 48 days. At 84 days, the baby in there, cries and feels pain. At 20 weeks, it hears and recognizes its mother's voice. And at 21 weeks, babies have been born spontaneously that survive. It's important to think that at 84 days, that child is capable of feeling pain. They've seen sonograms where the needle has been stuck into the womb to try and draw some blood, and the child will avoid the needle. Things like that. Those are really hard things to look at and think about, but they are important for us to know. There's been a shift in our society in the debate over abortion. After the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, allowing for abortion on demand because they could not determine the beginning of life, scientists couldn't tell the Supreme Court when life began. After that decision was made, the call was that women who wished to have an abortion, or the society that wanted to support women in their abortion rights, called the fetus just a clump of cells or a mass of tissue. Because when you see it early on, it doesn't really have a human form yet. But as science has become more mature and we know more about the development of the fetus, we now see that it is a human from the very first conception. And interestingly enough, there's a lot more talk about not fetuses, but more talk about babies, children in the womb. And on top of that, while many pro-choice people used to talk about, oh, it's just a clump of cells, now they know, well, there's a baby there. So the shift has come, and their arguments in general, has gone away from this just being something to get rid of, more to the rights of the woman to control her body. And of course, that has changed the debate. In fact, it's resulted, they feel in a reduction in abortions. I think since 1973, there have been 50 million abortions, at least, or more. It usually is about 1.5 million, but it's been the last couple of years about 1.2 million. And the interesting statistic that I saw was if you show a woman a sonogram of their baby, even in San Francisco Bay Area, 85% of the women decided not to have an abortion. Terrible liberal area, and yet they saw that this was life. And the one that really just kind of disturbed me the most, there's still work to be done, because about 65% of women who have abortion claim to be Christian.
Let me interject a couple things. This is some interesting kind of thoughts I've had this week about this subject. Some of these stats you gave me as well, I'll say those as well. Half of the women abort because it was an unplanned pregnancy, obviously, and one third of women have had an abortion by 45 years old. 3/4 of the time, the women cannot afford, or they perceive they cannot afford to care for the baby. 3/4 of the time, this very same attitude is that it would hinder them from their career or their work, and half of which they say, I'm unmarried and I don't know that I can take care of the child. So it enters into this, we have five times more people killed than the Holocaust since 1973, number one. Number two, you made a comment about a woman has a right to her own body, but the more I think about this, common sense would tell you that's really not her body, it's a body within a body. And this is a whole different ballgame. And I think we start talking along these lines, people have to kind of not just lap up what's told them, they have to kind of ponder and think about these things. When a baby, as we said last week, a mother is murdered when she has a baby in utero, then that's a double murder. But yet abortion is not. God is not the author of confusion. I don't know how we get this confusion going on here. And in addition to that, I would say when a baby dies prematurely in the womb, we say, well, that child, how many Christians have had abortions, you say?
65% of the abortion.
Okay, so 65%, if that is actually true, I don't even know what a Christian is anymore, but 65% of Christians
They claim Christian.
claim Christianity, but how many of them actually believe there's absolute truth?
We have no idea.
Okay, not all of them. So you say that baby is in heaven, right? So in other words, it can physically not be a person yet, but it has a soul. So now we're eradicating souls. It really gets confusing.
Yes.
We're made in the image of God. To be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord. I think we actually try to look for ways to rationalize our behavior. On the other hand, the amount of emotional wreckage and emotional harm and woundedness that exists among women today because of this issue is so profound I can't even go into it. I have no idea how many people, how many divorces, how many issues in life have come up for this sense of guilt and shame. And we need to be a church and are a church that hears to embrace those people and understand the grace and forgiveness of the Lord for these decisions. That's what we're about. We're not here to condemn anyone, but to restore. Anyway, I just throw these things out there. Common sense would tell you if something is growing, then it has to be alive. Does that make sense to you? Something is growing and developing, that's life. I don't know how at any one point we can say there's not life there when something's alive and it's changing each and every day, each and every moment. So anyway, just some thoughts about abortion.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, no, that's fine. I think it's important that we understand that we both have to be knowledgeable about these issues. We also have to have the ability to be sensitive to the people that are in these situations.
Always.
And the church generally hasn't done that great a job with that kind of sensitivity. Now, we're going to be talking more about some of these things 2 weeks from tonight, and we'll call that session Faith Steps. The idea being that, well, you've presented all this information, what am I supposed to do with it? And we'll have some examples and some further discussion, and at that time we'll have a book available to you that you can purchase that will outline a lot of what we've been talking about, written by a physician, a layman who happens to be a seminary graduate who is a lobbyist for the Christian Medical Dental Association in Washington, D.C., and he talks to all kinds of people, committees, congressmen, and he is representing a Christian viewpoint on these ethical issues. So we'll get into that more at that time. It's interesting to talk about some of the ways people look at the beginning of life. These definitions often are bandied about. Life begins when there's viability. Life begins when there's sensation present. Life begins at birth. Life is dependent on brain development. You have to have a brain. Quickening is often in olden times seen as the beginning of life because it was something that the woman and whoever she wanted to have could feel something happen, what was happening in her body. And implantation of the embryo is seen by some, and conception. In Christian circles, we viewed this as a potentially complete person, the embryo at conception, so we've really viewed that as the beginning of life. Then for another discussion we're going to have in a little bit about end-of-life issues, there's a list of functional definitions of life that apply from cradle to grave that are kind of interesting to think about because different groups of ethicists and philosophers and physicians have discussed these as possible ideas for what has to happen for you to be alive. One of them is consciousness. Another one is self-motivated activity. Another one is that you have a concept of yourself or who you are. You have a sense of future and past. You have a capacity to reason. You can communicate. You demonstrate self-control. You can relate to others. And you have curiosity. Unfortunately, these are all degrees. They're degreed personhood. And it's a real problem for the Christian in our society because somebody outside is deciding to what degree you are a person. And that enters into some of the changes that both happen early in life with mental retardation or children born with disabilities, or later in life as people lose their cognitive functions, or they become in some way incapacitated. They lose that type of a degree that would give them a personhood under these definitions. You have an advantage because you accept an external moral reality as Christians. Man has been made in God's image, and you accept that fact. So you have no fear of death or its consequences because Christ's resurrection has conquered fear for you. Now, that leads us into the discussion of euthanasia. You may have some comments on what we just said.
I know this is a can of worms that we probably don't need, well, we won't bring it up.
Well, we can try it if you need to.
Well, implantation, let's not. Let's move on. What is euthanasia? So let's talk about that, physician-assisted suicide, actually. Why is this becoming such an issue?
Yeah, I've seen this referred to as a breathtaking decision, which is kind of a cute play on words for a very serious topic. Is death a conquered enemy or an enemy to be conquered? I think we have to first start off with something that has bothered medical economics for a long time. Fully half the Medicare budget is spent in the last 6 months of life. meaning that those people are desperately trying not to die. And the physicians are desperately trying to keep them from dying. That doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, but it does give us cause to think about the circumstances under which that happens, particularly if somebody else is paying the bill. A typical circumstance, not to be too crass, is mother's living in Florida, and she's living alone and suddenly has a severe problem. Daughter and son and maybe another daughter fly down to Florida to help gather this person's thoughts, but she can't really say too much. And so they're talking to the physician, and the thing that's said is that this problem is going to result in 95, 98% of the time in this person's demise. She's not living that happy a life anyway. What would you want us to do for her? Well, spare no expense. Do everything possible, of course. And not that I'm against that, but I just think you have to come to terms sometime with the fact that care can be grave, the prognosis can be grave, and care can be futile. You need to have a discussion with the family, and you need to have an open and trusting relationship with the health care providers to give you good information. And you need to now know what the ethical background and world view is of your providers. Hospitals all have ethics committees now and ethicists on their staff. Their job is to go around and talk to the families and the patients of these people that are in situations where there's no recovery, and to try and get their understanding of what should happen or what they want to happen. Which leads us to the current medical perspectives on dying. Of course, a good death would include significant supportive and palliative care. That is, treatment that would not necessarily try to over-treat, but would give you support for pain relief and for and help with your bodily functions and nutrition. And we have to have respect. I'm talking about the physicians now, the current thinking. They have to have respect for the patient, recognizing that they do have autonomy. And so with that in mind, the hospitals will ask you, do you have a living will and a durable power of attorney in your possession on record? Do we have one? Or have you made one out? They will help you do that at the time you're admitted if it's an elective admission. The other thing that they generally will ask you is, if you were in extremis and had a cardiac arrest, do you wish to be resuscitated? That means, do you want the paddles put on your chest, and you want external compression, intubation to give oxygen? This is what resuscitation means. Those orders can be written at your request. Do not resuscitate. They can also be placed in papers that are notarized, signed by you with your intentions before you get in that situation. Of course, competent patients always have the right to refuse care. And this happens. They say, I don't want that done. And if they're competent, you can't force them to do that. And there is no legal right to assisted suicide. The 1997 Supreme Court said no constitutional right to assisted suicide in the United States of America. And there's no right to treatment considered futile by their physician, meaning that if a patient comes in and says, I want this and this and this done, but the last 2 or 3 things are totally futile, he has no right to do those just because you want them done. But there's increasing patient-directive care, meaning that there's increasing pressure on physicians to do what specifically they ask the physician or the medical caretakers to do.
person was thinking about a living will, and they're not even sick, maybe. What would you suggest they do in terms of preparing for such an eventuality? Like consult with a physician, consult with who, look at legal documents online. What are your thoughts on the whole topic?
All of the above. A living will is instructions for care if not able to make your own decisions. And as I say, there are forms online. The hospital has forms that can be completed. Most physicians' hospitals will at least have some forms. A lawyer can be consulted. You have to, usually you have to indicate whether you want heroic care, antibiotics, intubation, cardiac resuscitation, nutrition, hydration. But you also have to have that signed, witnessed, and notarized. So it has to be an official document. A power of attorney is essential because if you've done all those things, that's fine, but if somebody comes in and they question that, you have to have somebody assigned to make sure that those decisions are carried out in your the way you want them done. So they will get the authorization and authority to act in your behalf under these circumstances. We talked about do not resuscitate orders just a minute ago. I think it's kind of instructive to hear a little bit more about euthanasia. And what I will do is I'll just read a couple things that I thought were pretty interesting. This isn't necessarily in your handout, but this is a little vignette of somebody that talks about her her problem with the question of euthanasia. When I started losing my hearing about 3 years ago, it irritated my daughter. She began to question me about financial matters, and apparently feels I won't leave much of an estate for her. She became very rude. One evening, she said, she thought it was okay for older people to commit suicide. So I sit day after day knowing what I am expected to do. Another case.
Well, you change your will. After you get done with that, you don't have any idea what to do. You do whatever you want.
Mrs. P said that her primary care doctor encouraged her to take her own life due to congestive heart failure. She didn't actually say this. Somebody said it about her because she did take her own life. That the heart failure limited her activities. This doctor, who was her primary care doctor, told Mrs. P that this was not going to get any better. Her life was limited because she couldn't clean her house, and the pills she had to take made no sense. She followed his advice to the horror of her cardiologist, who saw her as a wonderfully outgoing person and having a pleasant personality with a future for interaction with her family and friends. Another interesting thing is that where is physician-assisted suicide now being done? It's been done in Belgium for quite a while. Luxembourg, Australia tried to do it, but they overturned it in 1997. The Netherlands started in 1973. Oregon, of course, has got a lot of press because it was the first state to pass a death with dignity referendum by a 51 to 49% vote in 1998. Washington State has enacted a ballot initiative in 2008, which went into effect in 2009. Vermont has an End-of-Life Choices Act signed into law May 2013. Montana gives a defense to a physician who takes a person's life for physician-assisted suicide. And it goes on. The one I found really horrifying was in the Netherlands in April of 2014, they passed a law that allowed any person over 16 to have access to physician-assisted suicide without any notification of their parents. So, you know, things are really happening around us. And the problem is that it's kind of a slippery slope. They say the Dutch have 3 passports. One is their nationality, and the other 2 are called the euthanasia passport and the life passport. In the Oregon paper, they said that the Oregon Medical Assistance Program now pays for physician-assisted suicide, but no longer would pay for adequate palliative care. What does that tell you? I think it tells you that a lot of people want to get rid of people when they're not what they consider useful. So, one person's option cannot become another person's compulsory duty. We saw that in the denial of fetus rights, fetuses' rights, and that we cannot extend that, and it can be extended to any other group, and that's what we're talking about. Again, we talk about the theoretical example, an aged parent in conflict with family. She's given a choice by her physician for maximal care or patient-assisted suicide. If she's depressed, has low self-esteem, or doesn't want to be a burden, this can create a duty to die in the vulnerable. Very definitely. We have to think about quality of life. What is the quality of life? It can be comparative, a life lived defined by accomplishments, how much you have and what's going on and so forth. And this is less desirable than one that's contributive, a life measured by contributions made to your world. Within 6 months to live, there's little hope for comparative contributions, but one can accomplish great things with their contributive ability, such as completing a task, a reconciliation with loved ones, a salvation opportunity. So at the end of life, a great paradox rises. We have decreased comparative value and increased contributive value.
Okay. Well, I think we'll have some questions about that. I think that the gist of this right here is you get to the end of your life, and a couple of things are happening. You're going to die with dignity, and you're not afraid of death, and you're looking forward to an eternal relationship in the presence of God. And then there's another scenario whereby you may not have a faith, but yet, ironically, you're playing God. And you're actually speeding yourself up to an alienation eternally from God, while others are speeding up the process. It's a fascinating thing to consider, especially when we throw money into it and relationships. And our perception of death. A person of faith should ideally have no fear of death, for death is the ultimate love reunion. Perfect love casts out fear. The person, you say there's no atheists in foxholes. I don't even know if that's true. I don't think I've ever truly been an atheist, but to be hopeless, what then would you fear? Then it becomes a quality of life issue, but you're missing out on the single best reunion ever in the history of history. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll generate some questions on that one. Let's move on to stem cells.
Okay, let me just say that I saw this article yesterday, a doctor-assisted disaster for medicine. Very good editorial.
Wall Street
Journal talking about an internist who has observed Oregon's problems. And Deanna, my wife, just handed me this evening on the internet news. They're talking about California lawmakers are making a second attempt at passing right to die legislation this year after an earlier attempt failed amid religious opposition. They got it through the Senate, but the House of Representatives tabled it because they didn't have enough votes. So it's being pushed. 24 states have introduced, but none have passed further right to die legislation.
Before we go on to stem cells, can we touch on something you brought up, and I don't see it in our notes, so I want to make sure we covered it, is medical tourism. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah. Well, I tried to do it quickly, briefly, when I was just talking about some of the areas you can shine a light on. It kind of started with the fact, mostly, there were a lot of treatments that were being offered that were ineffective or toxic, and particularly for cancer. And people would leave the States and go usually to Mexico or elsewhere to get these medications, sometimes with mixed results, mostly just stories of results, no data, but often with severe problems and a lot of expense. But as organ transplantation has become more available and more controlled, that means better outcome. There's a lack of adequate organs in our country, and long waiting lists, as you know. And so this became an attractive place for both private enterprise and governments into other countries to get dollars. So if you got a kidney or a heart surgery, for instance, in the United States, and it cost, say, $30,000, you could get the same surgery in a foreign country for $10,000. So if you don't have insurance, it's pretty attractive to travel over there. Again, I spoke about the fact that transplants were really, to start with, were the big thing, particularly kidney transplant. And there are claims, and they feel they're substantiated, that the Chinese were using patients that were prisoners that were to lose their lives and taking their organs and using them for this process. Meanwhile, charging the patient who's a medical tourist. The other thing is I just read an article today in Iran. They pay people a significant amount of money for their kidney, and that kidney will then be donated to the person who has a good match for it, usually a medical tourist who comes over and brings money. It's so bad that they have people standing outside of the hospitals and writing messages on the hospital wall how to contact them because they want the money.
People selling their organs. So this is India, China, Colombia, and Philippines?
Yeah, that's primarily where those things are going. But it's worldwide. And it's become such a thing as that, as we talked about medicine kind of controlling itself in the early 20th century with accreditation and stuff, they're beginning to talk about accreditation of medical tourism.
Yeah, medical. So if someone comes to me this week and says, hey, listen, I'm really not feeling well, I'm going to go to India, China, Colombia, or Philippines, or I'm thinking of going to Vermont, I'm going to get concerned.
Yeah.
All right. They may not have another appointment. Okay. Do we have time for stem cells?
Well, I think we can go through it.
All right, let's go through stem cells. What's the story with that?
Well, again, it's really in the news right now because of all the activity with Planned Parenthood. But just shortly, stem cells are nothing more than the cells of the basis of life. Fertilization leads to the division of cells, and for the first 7 days, every cell contains the information to give you a complete person. That's why if they split at the 2-cell level, you get twins. 3 cells, you get triplets. They can go up to 8, octomom, it's possible. Those are called totipotent cells. Through 8 weeks, each cell has the information to make 210 different tissue types. And of course, you can see this as highly desirable stuff because both for research and the possible treatment. And of course, because it's highly desirable, immediately ethical conflicts develop.
Okay, so what is science trying to do with stem cells? They're trying to get to some point where they can duplicate an organ?
Well, they can. Think about that. Nowadays, there are ways to develop cartilaginous models that they can hopefully begin to put cells that develop into different organs on and have these organs be functional.
Okay, so the ethicalness of this whole dilemma is stem cells can be taken from a placenta or the blood, is that correct?
Well, embryos, stem cells, we just talked about, embryonic. But there's another area where they come from, and that's from the patient's own bone marrow. And these are called mature bone marrow cells. They can also be taken from cord blood and placental sources. They're called multipotent cells. They come from living donors, and then they can become most cell types. The research is ongoing on these, and there are no ethical conflicts. In your handout, there's a chart to show the different diseases that can be treated. We already have heard about many people who have had leukemia and then have total body irradiation, and then they'll save their own cells, which usually doesn't work too well, or they'll find a donor and get the donor cells.
Right.
And they can use those to replace the bone marrow, and this is a curative procedure.
Well, in the last session, we go over faith steps. What can we do to make a difference? As a father whose 3-year-old son received a partial living donor liver, and as people in this congregation who actually have given organs one to another, organ donation is something that we can do.
Sure.
We could do. I was second in line in the country for a bone marrow transplant as a donor for a 46-year-old man with leukemia who lived in South Carolina, and I never got called back. Someone beat me out. But that is an action step. That's a faith step. Okay.
So let's just talk about the problem.
Right,
I think we can finish this off.
All right, let's do it.
What is the problem then? Well, it's really not about science. It's a human rights issue, again. And we just can't assume that these potential babies and humans are just cells to be destroyed, because we know they can develop into full persons. So in 1995, a Dickey Amendment was attached to, and thereafter something called a Dickey Amendment was attached to the yearly NIH budget. None of the funds made available in this act may be used for research in which human embryo or embryos are destroyed, discarded, or knowingly subject to risk of injury. Unfortunately, a loophole was rapidly developed so that only if federal funds were used was there a restriction. This is not only a problem from that point of view, it's an unethical reasoning step to use these embryonic cells. One author makes the comparison to Nazi Germany. And during the Second World War, the German physicians and researchers were pressured severely to try and develop new means of therapy for wounded. And because they had prisoners who were already condemned to death, of course by someone else, this became a valuable commodity that could not be wasted. And this is kind of the reasoned argument that people are using with stem cells.
Interesting.
So the intent of any medical intervention ought to be to avoid harm at all cost. Physicians take that oath when they graduate from medical school. It's part of the Hippocratic Oath. So these are serious topics. They've got some deep, deep meaning. Not everybody's going to be on the same page, even in this room, with what they see as the implications for them. I'm merely trying to bring you information, trying to tell you where the medical community has been and is trying to go, and get you to be informed so that we can go on to this last session.
Okay, how many fertilized eggs are there frozen in laboratories around the country?
I heard the figure 800,000.